Welcome back. My name is Emily Rubin, and I'm the Director of the Educational Outreach Program at the Marcus Autism Center. This is another part of our video module series on the Social Emotional Engagement Knowledge and Skills Program, otherwise referred to as SEEKS. Today we get to talk about measuring progress and our fidelity and sustainability of implementation of the SEEKS program in our early childhood settings across our school systems. In order for something to be sustainable, we need to have fuel. And I'm using that metaphorically. And what I mean by that is what is going to sustain this from a standpoint of funding and buy-in at the district level? How are we going to incentivize our schools to bring this into their initiatives for professional development and learning? And we are part of a new era in our public school systems right now because we had the Every Student Succeeds Act be passed into law in December 2015. And what you're seeing up there is a headline noting that ESSA, that law, has broadened our definition of school success. Whereas once we just looked at our academic measures of progress of our children, the new ESSA law, which is going to require us to broaden our measurement of school success and to use indicators such as student engagement. And we're going to be needing to be thinking about, are our children actually actively engaged in the learning setting? This particular fuel, this motivation to try to comply to the new laws of our federal government as we think about building in professional development and learning into our schools, it will ensure that we need to be thinking about how do we target student engagement, not only at the elementary and secondary level, but how do we begin to bring that in at our early childhood levels so that we can implement these tools to gather data, to really foster a smooth transition into kindergarten and provide continuity in our professional development and learning across our educators. So the fuel was going to be the incentive to really align our efforts at the early childhood level with those that we are implementing at the elementary and secondary level in order to prepare for measurement of student engagement. And as we've discussed in the previous video modules, the SEEKS program brings with it a tool for measuring student engagement. And this is the social emotional engagement ladder that we've been talking about. We're going to provide a tool for measuring a child's independence, investment, and initiation in the classroom. We're going to actually be able to have average engagement level data for each of the classrooms that we're targeting to show that students are actively engaged and therefore learning and being successful in the classroom and setting. Later in this particular module, or in future models, we're going to be talking about how to actually use this tool to measure social emotional engagement. As part of that fuel and incentive to continue to think about social emotional engagement levels in the classroom, our teachers are now going to be prepared to understand the neuroscience behind social emotional engagement. They're going to learn that it's not just about teaching social emotional skills so that children learn to fit in, but it's going to be about helping children understand the social world is really amazing. I need to pay attention to it and orient toward my teachers, pay attention to my peers, look at what they're doing and learn from them, and ultimately start liking and seeking out other children and teachers in the classroom, initiating quite a bit. That's going to build their language skills, and ultimately it's going to lead towards social maintaining, which is the ability to fit in and develop social and emotional skills and so forth. In terms of further incentive and the fuel for sustainability, how is SEEKS going to prepare us for what lies ahead? The Universal Design for Learning framework is really embraced within the new ESSA Act because the notion of providing an equitable learning environment so every student can learn and be successful is something that is really embraced by our educators both at the federal and state levels. The Universal Design for Learning framework has been well researched to understand that there are three really critical domains that we need to be thinking about when designing our lesson plans. The SEEKS program helps us to allow teachers to learn that we need to be fostering engagement, presenting information in multiple ways, and encouraging student expression in multiple ways for our students to be successful. In previous video modules, we've talked a lot about the importance of learning how to engage students in many different ways. We have a strong push toward literacy acquisition in the first couple of years of our schooling in early childhood, so we're going to be doing read-alouds in our classroom. But if we're looking for how do we foster engagement in children at varying developmental levels, it's important to think about if we want to stimulate their emotional investment in that literacy, we want to bring those books to life, get children to really love what they're hearing and reading, acting it out through hands-on materials and role play. And that's a strategy that our SEEKS teachers are going to be learning about, is how do we actively engage children in that literacy activity. The other domain of a universal design for learning, which would be providing information in multiple ways, is something that all of our teachers are going to be thinking about. How am I already doing that? How can I improve in those areas? This is an example in one of our particular SEEKS classrooms in which they were reading aloud on a day about a child playing in the puddles in the rain, and the props and the manipulatives are brought into that activity to really help them understand what the true meaning of wet, the concept of wet versus dry, stomping in the rain, and so forth. So we have the actual umbrella. There's actually a speech and language therapist hiding underneath that umbrella. And then you've got the children spraying water on top of the umbrella. They are actually understanding what wet is versus dry. They're understanding the story theme as well because they're acting it out, and information is provided in different ways. And finally, in the Universal Design for Learning framework, our teachers are going to learn about how they can foster expression in many different ways. Do they foster expression just through oral language, through written language, through pictures, through gestures? And are they fostering expression so children can learn how to communicate in meaningful social exchanges? And in this particular example, the child will learning how to read, but we also see that they're learning how to select which peer they're going to interact with at that given time, so that they can actually engage in what they're reading. So they're getting a choice of which peer to give a big hug to in this particular activity while it's a literacy activity. So those are the things that are going to fuel us to ensure that SEEKS is a sustainable initiative moving forward. We're fostering student engagement, we're measuring student engagement, we're using a Universal Design for Learning framework, and we're adhering to the new current law about fostering every student succeeds. We need to make sure that we're implementing it to a degree of sustainability and implementation science that's really strong. So we have a tool called the SEEKS Implementation Scales that's going to ensure that your school system is actually setting up success, that you're going to be able to have a district team and coaching teams at each school that are going to be able to sustain practices to a degree of fidelity that's going to make a difference for our students. And you're also going to be able to have the infrastructure to not only sustain practices, but ultimately replicate those practices in different schools as we move forward in the program. There are 4 different standards that we're going to measure with the SEEKS implementation scales, and you'll see them here kind of showing the progress. I'm going to look at each one of them individually. The first one is the SEEKS coaching teams that need to be established in your school system. You're also going to be looking for fidelity of implementation of SEEKS, how to coach to a degree of fidelity that is going to be sustainable, and then how to take data to show that you are making progress and being effective in what you're doing. So let's start with the coaching teams. The SEEKS implementation scales measures your degree of sustainability and ultimately replication of establishing coaching teams. What we're going to be doing in each school system that we support is that system core coaching teams would need to be identified at the system or district level. Then initial cohort school teams would need to be selected so that a school system can practice doing this in individual schools and see how it rolls out and establish that fidelity of practice. Ultimately, by the end of the road, independently, those schools are going to be holding their own coaching sessions to be able to have teacher-to-teacher mentorship, so teachers can mentor each other to foster social emotional engagement. And the district teams will then ultimately be replicating school-wide training and setting up coaching sessions at each of the new schools that they target by the end of year 3. We have in our SEEKS implementation scale a rubric so that you as a district can measure your progress toward that sustainability. And this is the first page of the SEEKS implementation scale. You'll notice where it says establish effective SEEKS coaching team over here. And you're going to score yourself at the beginning of year 1 as to whether or not you're not yet established, meaning you have no coaching teams at the district and site level, or if you're at a starting out level where you have identified some initial leadership at the system level. And I will tell you that at the system level, school districts are selecting a number of different professionals to take on that role. Occasionally, it might be in the areas of instructional coaching. It might be in the areas of school climate. Some of the teams that have already responsible for rolling out PBIS, which stands for Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. Those team members see this as another feather in their hat to helping create a climate of learning that is really fostering engagement and positive behavior. So the system core teams have been identified. You are starting out. Then you're going to identify some initial cohort school team members as an initial level to begin the process of mentoring each other. We usually pick around 5 to 6 teachers at each school, of general educators as well as special educators, maybe related service providers as well. As you move forward through the SEEKS implementation scales, these coaching teams move toward developing, deepening, and sustaining practice. And what the differences in the rubric are is how often those teams are meeting to coach and mentor each other and how independent they're becoming. Between a rubric score of a 2 and a 4, teams are moving toward independence. They're going to set up their own meetings. They're going to go into each other's classrooms and begin to mentor each other independently. And we will be learning about coaching and mentorship in a future video module. You will learn that that process is something that the teachers are really enjoying and see this as a part of their professional learning that they really crave and want to see happen in future sessions. So the next standard of the SEEKS implementation scale is to make sure that not only are we setting up coaching teams at the district and at the school level, we also need to make sure that we're implementing SEEKS to a degree of fidelity. So we call that the SEEKS and the Universal Design for Learning look-fors. Are we implementing it to a degree of proficiency? We need to make sure that there's fidelity of SEEKS and UDL instructional elements and that those instructional elements are tailored to the specific students that are being supported in those classrooms. In the SEEKS program, as we've mentioned previously, we need to make sure that they're developmentally sensible supports for children who are not yet talking. They're before words, they don't have pictures, they don't have sign language yet, or any kind of assistive technology. Or children who are at the emerging language level who are beginning to use speech, pictures, and sign language and so forth. And then children who are conversational level and are engaging with their peers and so forth. We need to make sure that we have instructional strategies that are meeting the universal design for learning and fostering their social emotional engagement to a degree of fidelity. So in a similar manner to the SEEKS implementation scales standard of establishing effective coaching teams, we have another page of the SEEKS implementation scale devoted to establishing effective universal design for learning and SEEKS instructional strategies that are stage specific. This is the standard we look at to see, are you becoming sustainable and ultimately able to replicate in terms of your fidelity of implementing these instructional strategies. So we're going to look at the rubric and say you're not yet established if you're not demonstrating stage-specific strategies for social emotional engagement at each of your developmental stages. You're starting out if the system, the district level folks and the school teams are demonstrating at least 33% of the stage-specific skills and that are measured by what we call the SEEKS instructional rubrics, a tool that we're going to be showing you how to use in a future video module. You would be at a 0 or not yet established if you are not yet demonstrating stage-specific social emotional engagement instructional strategies. Your teachers are not aware of how do I differentiate if I have a child who is at before words, emerging language at the conversational stage. And you move toward a starting out when we begin to show through the SEEKS instructional rubrics, a tool that we will be discussing in the future, at least 33% of fidelity of our instructional strategies, which really is equivalent to being at an emerging level in all of those areas of universal design. Moving from a 1 to a 2 means you're starting to now move toward proficiency. And by the time you get to a 3 or a 4, you're moving on to proficiency across the board, as well as exemplary implementation of social emotional engagement tailored to the developmental levels of the students in the classroom. So this is going to allow you to track your district and your school core teams' progress toward fidelity of implementation. So the third standard of the SEEKS implementation scales relates to something we call coaching techniques. We talk a lot about how we're going to be fostering coaching techniques, which we'll be addressing in a future video module. But we're going to need to know, are we implementing those coaching techniques to a degree of fidelity? And so we're looking at our effective coaching and peer-to-peer mentorship is essential to building capacity and sustainability at our cohort schools and across the district. This is really a key part of this because I always say that SEEKS is going to be as sustainable as much as the teachers like this approach. And if the coaching is not being implemented to a degree of fidelity, teachers may find it off-putting. They might not find it as supportive and safe and an environment where they feel they can challenge themselves professionally and continue to create new ideas for social emotional engagement for their students. So this is a really key part of that. So just similar to the other standards, I'm going to pull up now the SEEKS implementation scale document that looks at specifically the coaching techniques. Similar to the other standards of where we were establishing our coaching teams and measuring our fidelity of instructional strategies in the classroom, the SEEKS implementation scale also has a rubric for how effective are all of your teams coaching one another. We have the same rubric from a 0 to a 4, from not yet established to full sustainability. And the progress along that rubric, measuring from starting out, developing, and deepening, moves toward how much fidelity they are engaging with on our SEEKS Coaching Fidelity rubric, a tool that we'll be discussing in the future when we discuss the coaching techniques. But the idea of it is the more and more they are adhering to the positive coaching techniques that we use to facilitate a safe and appreciative environment for coaching, the more sustainable this will be at that particular site. And the more the district team is aware of the coaching fidelity, the more that they'll be able to replicate that in future coaching sessions. The final standard of SEEKS implementation scales that we want to make sure that your teams at the district and school site level are progressing on is the use of collecting their own SEEKS data. And that means that both system or district level teams and the school cohort teams will need to learn how to use SEEKS data to foster a universal design for learning and also to measure student engagement. They will also be using data to measure their own coaching fidelity. So teams are going to be leaving with a tool to measure their fidelity of practice, how much student engagement they're engaging in the classroom, as well as how well they're coaching and mentoring one another. So similar to the previous standards, we have a rubric that shows from not yet established to full sustainability how well teams are taking their own data. This particular page describes the rubric for measuring a system and school cohort team's ability to establish SEEKS data collection. You would be measuring your district and school team's ability to demonstrate data collection methods for student engagement and fidelity of SEEKS instructional strategies. If you're beginning to do that with our support or with the support of technical assistance, you would be at starting out. In order to move toward developing a developing level, you'd also be talking about measuring your coaching fidelity as well. And by the time you get to a 3 or a 4, district teams are now independently taking their own data on student engagement, the fidelity of SEEKS instructional strategies, coaching fidelity, and then using that data to engage in professional learning activities to increase their competencies in each of these areas. And so we're needing to make sure that you're feeling safe and comfortable with using the data collection techniques. So as we finish talking about the SEEKS implementation scales, we just reviewed those 4 standards of building your coaching teams, of measuring your fidelity, of making sure that you are coaching to a degree of fidelity and that you're taking your own data. You might be very curious about establishing some performance measures and figuring out how long does this take to roll out the SEEKS program. And generally speaking, since we have been working with the programs in the State Personnel Development Grant Project now for 3 years, we can see that it's about a 3-year process. Some districts are moving along a little bit faster than others, and each can measure their progress using the SEEKS implementation scales. So I'm going to share with you what I would consider to be sample yearly progress measurement so you can determine that it may take between 1 and 3 years to move toward a fidelity and replication of the project. This particular performance measure would be for year 1. What would you be working toward in the first year of implementation? We would write it as, by the end of year 1, the district SEEKS team and the SEEKS cohort schools would move from an average score of a 1 or a 2, maybe an emerging or a developing, to a 2 or a 3, which would be a developing to a deepening of practice on the SEEKS implementation scales. We would be averaging all 4 of those standards together. The key indicators at the end of year 1 is that you would have established and organized your SEEKS coaching teams at the district and school level. You'd be establishing regular school meetings for teachers to do peer-to-peer mentorship with each other to increase student engagement and talk about universal design for learning strategies, and that you would be at least at an emerging degree of fidelity in the instructional strategies designed to foster social emotional engagement in that stage-specific way. As you move on to year 2, we have seen a natural progression of our schools where they want to take on the concept of developing the district team and the cohort schools. They're starting out at an average score of either a 2 or a 3, which is their developing and deepening levels of SEEKS implementation scales, and they're going to move toward a 3 or a 4, which would be either deepening and sustaining a level at the SEEKS implementation. The key indicators at the end of the second year would be that you would be holding independent SEEKS school team meetings at each school so that your teachers are meeting and talking about their practice, figuring out what's working in the classroom to foster engagement and what those next steps are, and you're doing that independently. You don't need any technical assistance either from the outside of the district or within even that district team. The proficiency of your fidelity is also improving. You're really starting to implement strategies for fostering social emotional engagement at a proficient degree. You're also now proficiently showing fidelity in how you're engaging in teacher-to-teacher mentorship. And by the end of year 2, you would actually begin to be conducting your independent data collection to measure a student's social emotional engagement levels as well as your instructional fidelity of classroom instruction. So now we're shifting into year 3. So districts that have been in the SEEKS projects going into year 3 are setting goals such as this. By the end of year 3, the district SEEKS team and the cohort school teams will maintain or move to an average score of a 3 to a 4. Some have already gotten to a 3 and they're just maintaining it. Others are now moving up toward that level by the end of the year. So you would be at either a deepening or sustaining level of SEEKS according to the SEEKS implementation scales. The key indicators are a bit broader now. We want to see lots of different things from a SEEKS district at year 3. We want to see that you're independently holding SEEKS school team meetings to engage in teacher-to-teacher mentorship. You're now at a proficient or an exemplary degree of fidelity of instructional strategies to foster social emotional engagement. You're either proficient or exemplary at coaching fidelity as well. You're now independently and reliably taking your data and using that data for furthering your professional development plans. And even better, at year 3, the district team is going to begin to replicate SEEKS trainings to introduce new schools to the project and implement new coaching teams and new schools. And of the districts that are participating in our state personnel development grant, we have been thrilled with how they have taken this on internally and actually have broadened this to new schools that we as technical assistance providers have not even set foot in because the district teams are taking this on and setting up their own coaching sessions. I've also seen some wonderful things at the individual school level at year 3. If you had the original school that was there at year 1, new teachers come on board into the SEEKS teams as we move through these years. And what you'll see is the new teachers in year 3 had higher baseline scores than the teachers in year 1 because it starts to become part of the community of the way students are receiving support from their educators through peer-to-peer collaboration and mentorship. So now we get to learn the tools of SEEKS. We get to learn how do we implement these tools to measure our fidelity and our sustainability. How do we get started? We have 3 tools that we'll be using to measure the fidelity of our implementation of strategies, how to measure student engagement levels, how to set up our teams, and then a 4th tool that I will be covering in the future. And so let me share with you what those tools are going to be. The first one is going to be the SEEKS organizational chart. Who is on your SEEKS team at the district level? Who is on your SEEKS team at the school level? We're going to have to organize that and define their roles and responsibilities. The next tool that I want to share with you is the SEEKS Social Engagement Ladder, which you have also had some exposure to in previous video modules. And finally, we'll be covering today the SEEKS Instructional Fidelity Rubrics. How do we measure the classroom fidelity in terms of implementation of supports specific to different developmental levels? And in a future video module, we'll be talking about the SEEKS Coaching Fidelity Rubric, which is how do we measure that our teachers are mentoring each other to a degree of fidelity that's going to be sustainable and that they're really going to enjoy using in future coaching sessions independently. So the first tool I wanted to make sure that you were aware of and how to complete it would be the SEEKS Organizational Chart, also nicknamed the SEEKS Org Chart. And this helps you define who are the key players on your SEEKS team. It'll also help you define the concept that this is not just about an individual school, it's about the district developing of infrastructure to be able to sustain and replicate these practices in the future. So we need to define that. We have a to-do list for filling out the SEEKS organizational chart. The first thing we need to do is confirm the district team members and their roles in this process. The next thing we need to do is identify at least 1 to 3 initial schools that we'll be targeting to implement the SEEKS implementation scales and to kick off the program. School districts have chosen to do so based on funding or investment or even the size of the district. Some of the districts are rather large that we've worked with and others are very small. So it really depends on many factors as whether you roll out with 1 school or 3 schools to begin with. And then finally, the third to-do item is to identify at least 6 teachers at each of those schools to make up your SEEKS team at those initial sites. So for example, if you've had 3 schools that you've selected as cohort schools in your school system, you might have 18 teachers involved in this project. So it takes on a different kind of overall scope depending on the size and the number of schools involved. The SEEKS organizational chart, which hopefully you will have as well printed in front of you, looks a bit like this. It basically gives you the opportunity to indicate what your district's name is, what the school year is, your year of implementation. You might have multiple cohorts going, so that's an optional here that you would put in there just to kind of indicate that. And the idea here is that you're establishing a sustainable infrastructure for the future. So we're going to be indicating who are your technical assistance facilitators. For example, it's the Georgia Department of Education serve the role as technical facilitators for this particular project. I've indicated that SEEKS is currently developed by myself, Jennifer Townsend, and Leslie Vittori. These are also sources of technical assistance for the project. So that's what's going to be completed into that line here. And then the district administrators are those that are kind of funding and providing you the support for implementing this in your district. And then those are the project leads in your district. And that are those people who are really sustaining the work and scheduling and getting people on board and making sure you're meeting with school administrators and so forth. And also learning a lot about the coaching techniques. These district project leads are going to be the folks that are actually going to be replicating the trainings in the future to do introductory trainings at new schools that come on and facilitating coaching sessions. So the difference between your formal district administrator who is helping you figuring out the budget and allocation of time versus the district project lead who actually is going to be boots on the ground going out and doing some of these trainings, actually collecting some of the data and using and analyzing for the future. So there's two different levels. Now, having said that, in smaller school districts, you may be both. You may have a district administrator who is also the boots on the ground district project lead. It really depends on the size and obviously the organization of your school system. Then below that, you'll have an opportunity to complete which of the schools are going to be involved in your project. Those school administrators, there's leading administrators, the principals and so forth that are involved. And then you're going to indicate who is a SEEKS point person at that school. Sometimes that's the assistant principal. Other times it's an instructional coach, a guidance counselor, or a lead teacher at the school that's going to be the point person for setting up coaching sessions, collecting data, and so forth. And then indicating the actual SEEKS core team members in that final column at the bottom. It's always better to look at a form that's completed than to look at it more abstractly. So I wanted to give you a sample here. This is a district that is now in its third year of implementation of SEEKS, and so they now have 4 schools in the project. They started out with 1 in their first year. So by the 4th year, they've brought on systematically new schools each year. And the technical assistance facilitator really is the Georgia Department of Education and myself that you see up here. And then the district administrator at that particular district, I'm calling her Christy. She is the person who is championing the work in the district and making sure that there's infrastructure support, funding, and time for the district team to operate and to support their cohort schools. The district project leads in that particular district include actually about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's actually a very large district project lead team, but it is what they've chosen to do. And that includes their early childhood coordinator, their lead assistive technology specialist. You see an instructional coach, someone who is a former special educator who actually in year 1 was in the classroom, and now by year 3 she's serving as a district coach for the social emotional project. You'll also see the lead speech and language pathologist that they're using, an autism support individual, and then another instructional coach. This small army, if you will, of project leads are going to be going out to different schools, doing introductory training, setting up coaching sessions so that they can spread this from their 4 initial schools to, the somewhat 30 to 40 other schools they have in that district. If you look here at the school names, this is where we would indicate the particular elementary and early childhood programs that are in the project right now. Those are the school principals that are listed under each of those names. And then each of those schools has a point person, so the district lead knows who to email to make sure that data and coaching sessions are scheduled efficiently and that everybody knows about upcoming sessions. As you'll see underneath that there's around 4 to 5 SEEKS team members at each schools. Some of the districts are choosing more like 6 or 7. It's really up to you. I wouldn't want it to be too much larger than that, but you have to think about coverage for meetings and coaching sessions across the year. The next tool that we're going to be talking about that's going to help you implement SEEKS to a degree of fidelity and to be able to sustain your work is going to be the SEEKS Social Engagement Ladder. We've talked about this in the previous video modules about the importance of having a tool that will be able to measure how your teachers are fostering a student's social and emotional engagement. We're going to be using this to measure the whole class and how well they're actively engaging in the classroom. As we've talked about, we need to know that engagement is not just a child doing their work and doing as told, but how independent they are in the classroom using the targeted materials, how much emotional investment they have, and how much initiation. Going back to the neuroscience, that's absolutely crucial. We need to see that the children are lit up, they're excited to learn, they're playing with their peers, and they're engaging with their students. So we need a rubric to be able to measure this and to be able to show your overall average engagement levels. We've talked about what does social engagement look like in the past video modules. Using this particular example, in fleeting moments you can see it more clearly, that overall this particular child is not completely unresponsive. He's in proximity with the teacher and does momentarily later engage with her, but at that moment he really is what we would gauge as emerging fleeting. And if you would go back to the tool and look at the rubric to look at what emerging fleeting actually indicates, is that a child might be responsive on occasion, but not always consistently responsive to bids for interaction, and that he's not showing a lot of positive emotion, he's not emotionally invested, and so forth. So that's where that emerging fleeting kind of rubric score is. Going back here, he starts to become more partially engaged, and what that refers to is he's starting to respond more consistently to teacher instructions as she becomes more playful with kind of enticing him into the task and so forth, responding to bids for interaction and so forth, but still not showing that much investment and excitement and positive emotion. As you move up the rubric toward full engagement, I always like to say a 4 is when a child has basically forgotten they want to be doing anything else but engaging with you. They're highly emotionally invested, they're initiating, and they're independently engaging with the targeted materials. Now, we don't score the social engagement ladder on a momentary by momentary basis. There is a brief instructional part of it right before the manual that indicates you probably should be watching a natural activity for the full duration and looking for about 20 to 30 minutes in the classroom. So students will vary along those 20 to 30 minutes. If they vary, it's usually between a 2 and a 4, and if that's the case, you end up kind of scoring that particular student out of 3. Very rarely do we go from a 0 to a 4 and all the way back, so you're going to kind of come up with this student was generally at about a 3, was generally at about a 2 as you move through those 20 to 30 minutes of observation of those natural activities. So you probably are itching to practice a little bit of how do you measure social emotional engagement in the classroom. So I would encourage you to have the student engagement ladder out in front of you and be looking at these particular students. We're going to be scoring the whole group using tally marks right now on our SEEKS social engagement ladder. How many of those students are fully engaged? So they're initiating, they're independently engaging with the targeted materials, and they're highly emotionally invested. Those are the kids that are forgetting they want to be anywhere else, and there's a couple of them at least that are going to pop out right away. They are loving what they're doing in this particular activity. Then you're going to look for those children who are engaged. They're initiating, they're independently doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they're invested. But there's still room for possible opportunity for even further excitement, further engagement. And then there's those kids that are partially engaged. They're kind of doing as they're told. They follow directions. They're there. They're only seldom showing positive emotion. And at the emerging fleeting, are there students in this video, and I am hinting that there might be, a student that is only responding on occasion, seems a bit either anxious, disinterested, or somewhat just not engaged, not showing that investment, not showing that independence, and not showing that initiation, but not completely no focus. In fact, there's an occasion in which she does participate, but you'll see that you're not going to want to score that student higher than a 1. So it shows you where are the variabilities in this particular group. So it's always good to practice. I've just introduced or reintroduced the social engagement ladder to you. And so I'm going to put you into a classroom sitting, and I'm going to have you attempt to think about where are the engagement levels of this particular student. And because the video only captures a certain number of the students, there are 9 in the classroom, but I'm only going to have you consider, I believe, 8 of them. So you're going to see this child right here. There is a child to her left that you'll also be able to see. you'll see this young girl with the red shirt and this one here with the pink. You'll have these two boys, and then you will have another two children here. So 2, 4, 6, 8. There's a child that is totally invisible the whole time, so you will not be looking at that child. Not to worry if you miss a few of them. We'll be talking about which ones that are most salient as we go forward. They're going to be singing a good morning song, which I absolutely adore. The artist's name is Lori Berkner. She is one of my favorite musicians to foster engagement, present information in multiple ways, and get children to show what they know. Her music just lends itself to a really universal access. While she's going to be talking about the days of the week, they're going to be thinking about chasing each other, because on every day of the week, no matter what you do at school, you have a great day, and the song is all about, I'm going to get you, you'd better run. And you're going to see how much these children love coming to their Good Morning Circle because they feel that sense of movement, excitement, and connection with each other. So I'm going to go ahead and play that video for you. You watch it through. If you might want to rewind it and watch it several times to think about each of the individual students that you're seeing.
Shy face, but then I turned around. Let me see your rhyme, I heard a sound. It said, I'm gonna get you, you better run. I'm gonna get you, here I come. And I jumped into Saturday, and I had a baseball bat a day. Get your bats ready, 2 hands, and the swing.
So you may have chosen to kind of rewind that, watch that several times, because it is hard to look at a large group of students at the same time and think about each individual student's overall engagement level. What we're looking for, though, is we're looking for rates of initiation, rates of independence, rates of emotional investment. So it's easier to start with those that are really fully engaged in this activity when I'm thinking about it. And you think about this little boy right here who was so excited when it was his day of the week to go up to put his day of the week onto the board. He just stood up there, independently engaged with the targeted materials, showed a degree of emotional investment because he didn't just do it on his own, but he shared it with his peer right here. And then he also showed a degree of initiation. He was showing the initiation with putting the picture on the board, turning toward his peer, and initiating in the motions. And he also had the sense about him that is like, I think I don't want to be anywhere else but singing this song with my class. And that makes me want to put him at a 4. That shows a full degree of active engagement right there. I just have to share with you that that is a child that has a social emotional learning disability. So to see him so successful means the instructional strategies that are in place are really fostering his access to the curriculum. Had the song not had the movement, had it not had a clear visual endpoint, so presenting information in different ways, and to give him a chance to be independent, to show what he knows with the visual support in his hand, he may not have had such a strong degree of active engagement, which is exciting to see. So this is a good example of a 4, and I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't bring in this child to his left right here. So I'm going to shift you to this image of it so you begin to see some of the different engagement levels. This child right here was like a peer role model for the little guy to his left, was fully engaged. I mean, his whole body's into this, independently initiating with the materials in appropriate ways, showing emotional investment and initiating as well. You also have another red line of full engagement to this young girl right here. She was the one who knew exactly when it was her turn to get up from the seat and go over and put my baseball picture, because it's Saturday and we play baseball on Saturday. This particular school was really into baseball, so that was something that was perfect for them. And she went back to her chair after initiating that particular exchange and was already in the motions of ready to swing her bat independently. So she's showing emotional investment, she's showing initiation, and she's showing initiation. So thus I would put those three right there at full engagement. You see this particular child here and the child that you only had a few moments to look at over here, they were mostly engaged as well, because they're initiating, they're independent, they're showing emotional investment. They just weren't like completely lost in the moment like the other three. I do hold off my 4 scores. I don't give those out very generously. But those kids right there, I mean, for goodness sake, they're loving this, right? So that's what the 4s are used for. Now, there was a child that you noticed, or may have noticed right here, that had sort of some assistance behind her. And you'll notice that she would be scored, in my mind, more of an emerging fleeting. Was she responsive? Not consistently. Was she initiating? Certainly not consistently. Was she independent? Not consistently. Was she completely no focus? No, she was there. She was sitting where we expected her to be sitting. She'd even occasionally look toward her peers, and there was one occasion that you may or may not have seen in which she kind of put her hands together. That's an example of an emerging fleeting. She's there, but there's opportunities to increase her engagement. And one of the things that we want to think about as we move to our checklist and coaching that we did in our previous video modules is to think, if our goal is independence, to think about, is it really helpful to have someone around her from behind? She's independently maintaining her proximity in the chair, so in that situation I might want to back off entirely and make sure that she has space and movement to be able to initiate movement on her own. But so this gives you a little bit of a sense of how we make these determinations. It's not easy to do the social engagement ladder, and I've done it in classrooms as small as 4 or 5 children, as well as big as 35 children. And when you have that many, you have to, I often recommend that you actually draw a map on your clipboard and kind of go around and draw the children as a number and use a pencil, because they may change from a 4 to a 3 or a 2 to a 3. And after your 20 minutes, you'll have a sense of where the engagement levels are, and if a child might be really, really engaged over here, but a child whose opportunity to increase engagement on the left side of the room, you want to notice that. So a summary of that data collection would be on this particular slide here. You'll see the engagement ladder rubric from a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's where you would typically put the tally marks. It says indicate either the students' names or just tallying the numbers up in here. And what you'll see is I ended up putting 3 students at a 4. And those were those 2 boys and that young girl who put the baseball picture on. I put them all at a score of a 4. I had 3 students that were at a 3. Those were students that were there. They were excited, but they weren't fully vested in the activity, but certainly doing quite well. And then 1 student was at a 2, which was more responsive or partially engaged. And finally, that 1 student that I mentioned at the emerging fleeting level. What you then do is you have 3 students getting a score of a 4, that's 12 points, if you will. 3 students getting a score of a 3, 1 student getting a score of a 2, and then 1 student getting a score of a 1. And you divide that by the total number of students, and you end up with an average score of a 3. And what does that mean? This was a rockin' activity. That's what that means. You have 9 children with a wide range of learning abilities in there, and your average engagement score is mostly engaged. That's a beautiful activity, and that's why I put that rock on right here. Our performance measures for our teachers are actually somewhere between a 2 and a 3. Usually we go for about a 2.4 or 2.5 performance measure. And that means that you're having a bell curve of engagement between a 2 and a 4. That's beautiful. Certainly there's an opportunity to increase the engagement of the student that was at a 1, and that's something we would do in a mentorship session, is saying, I wonder how we might increase engagement for that student. I think the other students, however, are truly benefiting from this activity. So now that we've measured the student engagement levels in the classroom, so we just looked at overall excitement, some children being fully engaged, some children being mostly engaged. There are children in there that have emerging fleeting levels. We have an understanding that there are strengths in the classroom and that there are opportunities for next steps. It's really helpful at that point then to think, let's look at the instructional fidelity. What's working in this classroom? Clearly there are a number of strategies that are clearly supporting a children's social emotional engagement. However, there might be some areas that will be opportunities for us to consider. Maybe we can increase certain instructional strategies so that we can help all of our students be successful. That's the goal of the Every Student Succeeds Act, so we have to make sure that each student has an engagement level that is productive for learning. So to do that, we're going to look at something called the SEEKS Instructional Fidelity Rubrics. We need another rubric that will measure how much implementation fidelity is that teacher using when fostering engagement, when providing information in multiple ways, and when fostering expression in multiple ways. So we have a score form that you see over here that you might have printed in front of you, where each of those 3 domains is listed along the left-hand side. Under each domain, there are 3 standards that we try to measure related to each of those areas of competencies. And then you'll see that there'll be dates of rating. So you could use the same form to rate 6 different intervals across a school year. Typically, I will tell you that most of the schools are taking baseline measurement in the fall and then also then looking again in February or March. But you could be looking at this on a monthly or every other month basis to see the instructional fidelity in the classroom. How do we actually measure that instructional fidelity? We have rubrics that are stage specific. This one right here is the before words rubric. So what does instructional fidelity look like in students that are before words, that are not yet talking? We would also have, by the way, one that is for students that are emerging language, children who are beginning to use language, speech, pictures, and voice output devices. And then we have a rubric for those that are conversational level language. This is a really important concept because so often we're looking at instructional fidelity in classrooms and not considering the levels of students that the teacher is supporting. And so we're going in there and measuring what a teacher's fidelity regardless of what levels of students they're supporting in the classroom. And SEEKS has very developmentally specific rubrics for that. So going back to the before words rubric that I introduced earlier, what you would see along the left-hand side is foster engagement, present information in multiple ways, and as you turn the page, it would say to foster expression in multiple ways as well. And then it will show you what would it look like at each standard to be exemplary, which would be a score of a 3. What would it look like at each standard to be a proficient, which would be a score of a 2? Or emerging, which would be a score of a 1, or just not yet there, which would be a score of a 0. So you have a rubric from 0, 1, 2, 3 to measure a teacher's instructional fidelity in each of these particular standards. When I'm observing in the classroom, the first question that comes up is, which rubric do you use? Do you use the before words, the emerging language, or the conversational level? Now, if I were to use this rubric in a science class in 6th grade, and all of the students are at grade level or at least nearing grade level, then what would happen is I would use the conversational level rubric. If I'm using this in a 1st grade classroom or a Head Start preschool classroom, and 60 to 75 to 80% of the children are conversational level, they're using creative language, they're talking with each other and so forth, but there are children in there that we would gauge as emerging language level, children who are maybe English language learners, they don't have a full command of developing creative sentence structure. Then I would probably use the emerging language stage rubric. Even though there are conversational language students in the classroom, the instruction needs to be tailored so that everyone in that particular classroom is getting access to the type of supports they need to be fully engaged. We would use a before words rubric if we're in a classroom that a student who is not yet talking, not using any sign language, speech, or voice output or assistive technology. And even if that teacher has conversational level students in her classroom, there are before words students there, we've got to use the before words rubric, because even at a tier 1 level, before we have an individualized educational plan in place, we need to make sure that that rubric is in place for that child to access the curriculum and be successful. This, just so you are also thinking about it from a more developmental perspective, the SEEKS rubrics are being used in the Department of Early Care and Learning settings where there are children who are birth to 18 months, birth to 3 years of age, and so the before words rubric is just what we would expect in an early child care program for very young children. That's the type of supports that we would like to see in that environment as well. So let's practice using this. We just watched a wonderful example of Lori Berkner's Good Morning song. Let's continue to watch that circle time, and then we can see if we can practice scoring that particular teacher. And so in this particular setting, we had those 9 students that were being engaged in this. We have to be thinking there's got to be some strengths. There's definitely some proficient strategies in place. Are there any that are emerging, that are a little bit more of an inconsistent opportunity for increasing consistency and then therefore increasing student engagement? That's our question that we have. We're going to use the emerging language rubric for that particular teacher. And the reason being is if we go back and think about those individual students, there are students in here that are conversational level. This young lady right here and this boy right here, you get them going in a conversation and they'll tell you about the past, the present, the future, what their plans are in the summer. I mean, they are very conversational level children. And so typically if it was just them, we would use the conversational rubric. But we have 2 other students that I would point out, this little girl right here and this boy right here, who are still beginning to learn how to make their own sentence structures. They're learning how to use language either through speech or through pictures to communicate. So using the emerging language rubric will ensure that we have at a tier 1 level the instructional strategies that is going to help all of those children be successful. So pulling out that emerging language rubric, you have it on your clipboard when you're watching in the classroom in order to gather this data. How do you take all those words in? My recommendation for you is to not be reading them all. Look at one particular column, and I typically find myself looking at proficiency, because that's our goal, is a proficiency. If someone is exemplary, fabulous, but that's not really our performance measure. We want to shoot toward proficiency. And so I'm going to look at proficiency for fostering engagement number 1 as I'm watching this particular teacher. And I'll go ahead and read that particular criterion out for you. And it says, is this teacher consistently providing access to and directly referencing? So having something but not referencing it doesn't count. So consistently accessing and then directly referencing, and on occasion encouraging independent use of strategies of using a daily agenda. So is there a schedule posted on the wall for that we're going to Good Morning Circle, and then after that we're going to go to a break, and then we'll go outside and play? Is she using a daily agenda? Does she also have what we call a within task agenda? So does she have a schedule for circle time? And we're going to see that in just a moment. As you see, she pulls out this big foam board that indicates we all finished with our good morning song, and now it's time for calendar. So not only does she have a daily agenda posted in her classroom, that she has a schedule that she shows them at each individual step of Good Morning Circle time. So this is an instructional strategy that she's using with such degree of proficiency, it's quite notable. So we go back to our criterion. Is she using a daily agenda and within task schedules? Is she using multimodal or environmental cues to help children understand that we're finished with one song and going on to the next? I'll let you watch a little bit more of the activity and you can begin to judge that yourself, so that students can predict the sequence of activity and the steps toward completions. So proficiency in this particular standard under getting children engaged is, does she let them know where they're going and what they're going to do when they get there? And you're looking at all the different visual and multimodal cues she's using in order to help them accomplish that. As we go into the number 2, the question becomes, have supports been embedded proactively so that students maintain active engagement in the classroom throughout the whole lesson? And we already know there might be a little bit of a red flag, because we did the student engagement ladder, and what did we find? That there was a student that was at a 1. So I might be thinking to myself, is she consistently helping students stay engaged? So I'm going to read that criterion, and then I might be thinking about either a 1 or a 2. Maybe it's only emerging at there. Is she consistently planning and implementing supports to foster the independent use of self-regulatory strategies to sustain engagement, so to keep children up and excited and to prevent escalation? So is she monitoring their signals of attention? Is she getting children excited when they need to be, helping them calm when they do, offering them coping strategies? Those are the things that we look at that particular stage. I'm going to just point out those 2 right there to think about the differences. Man, is she really strong at letting children know what's going to happen and what's going to happen next. We might be looking here to see, is it truly consistent for all of the students in the classroom, or is it more of an emerging skill for that teacher? And as we move over here to the final one that I want to really focus on for today would be fostering engagement. Number 3, has individual students' interest and desires and motivations been considered proactively to stimulate engagement? Is she consistently planning that tasks involve purposeful application and engaging social interaction, such as a social request or writing a word for a purpose or meaningful? Is there real-life experiences and so forth? And I can already speak to the fact that she chose a Days of the Week song that I'm quite partial to, because it isn't just let's rotely go through the days of the week, but Lori Berkner has put Days of the Week in the context of what might happen on a Monday, what might happen on a Tuesday, and what do we do every day but have fun at school. So the song really brings that real life piece in, embeds the movement in there and the social interaction of I'm going to chase you. So she's definitely brought elements of that into this lesson as well. So I want you to look at those three areas in particular. I'm going to show you several more video clips from the moment, and we'll come back to those three areas to see if we can make a judgment as to whether they're a 0, a 1, a 2, or a 3, which would be truly exemplary.
Let's check in with our schedule. Did we do hi, hello? Yeah. All right. Did you sing the days of the week? Yeah. Did we do our big calendar? Yeah. Okay, so now it's time for the songbook. Let's see. Who hasn't had a turn yet this morning?
So the first clip you just saw was the teacher going through the schedule within the schedule. So she's indicating we're all finished with the Good Morning song. Now it's time to go on to our songbook. I've edited the video so you're going to see just the end of the song choices that each of the children had. They all got a chance to choose a different song they wanted to sing, and now they're moving on to calendar time. In calendar time, every child has their own calendar book in their hand, and as the calendar up on the front of the board is changed, everybody changes the calendar in their binder. So everybody has a role of determining what month of the year it is, what year it is, what today is, what tomorrow is, what yesterday is. They take the day of the week and they stick it into their own spot, so they're really actively engaged in producing the outcomes on their own. So that's what you're going to get to see here. The very tail end of another Lori Berkner song about dinosaurs and what dinosaurs do. All the dinosaurs are going to be asked to go into their cave to finish off that activity, which would be under their little cube chairs. Everybody get out your calendar book and get started.
Boys and girls, put those dinos in a cave under your chair. Put them in a cave under your chair. And take out your calendar books. Thanks, Alice, for getting a tissue. Boys and girls, songbook is all done. It's time for calendar books. I'll take little D up here with me. Machias. D, come on up here with the book. And I'll take Elsie. Come on up here too. Yep, D, you coming up here too? It's me. Okay, hold on. What are we going to start with? What's the month Machias? Well, we celebrate Easter in this month, but what month is it? April. What does it have on it? A bunny rabbit. A bunny rabbit. And when you're all done, touch your head. Thank you. Ben, what's the year?
The year's 2011.
2011.
So what you just saw now is several other portions of that same Good Morning circle. You saw Lori Berkner's song for Good Morning, I'm Going to Get You, You'd Better Run. You saw a transition to a song choice activity where she said, all right, everybody gets a choice to sing a song. The very tail end of the dinosaur activity where they're asked to go into their caves so they can get out their calendar book. And across each one of those transitions, she's shown her visual schedule to indicate the progress of steps toward completion. So that's one of the things that you might have noticed. We're going to think about that whole activity and think about our rating key of absent, emerging, proficient, exemplary, and then we're going to be filling in the scores of that particular instructional rubric. As I mentioned previously, we're using the emerging language stage rubric to score this particular classroom because she has students who are just beginning to use speech, just beginning to use pictures and other forms of communication. And I'm just going to focus today on fostering engagement. And I always mention to you to keep it simple, start with the level of a 2 of proficiency and see if the teacher's kind of coming this way or that way around that particular box. That's going to help you with the scoring. And so as I mentioned before, the first item that we're going to be looking at is our supports in place to help children predict the sequence of activities and the steps toward completion. We go over to that proficiency area, and did we have a sense that it was going to be circle time? Unfortunately, you didn't get to see this, but I'm letting you know that she does use a very clear daily agenda to indicate it's all done playtime, it's time for Good Morning Circle, and snack will follow of some sort. So she is showing them and using consistently the daily agenda, but she's also using what's called a within task schedule. And that's a real key part of social emotional engagement, knowledge, and skills, is that we can't just post a visual schedule for the day up here and think that children are going to be able to predict the sequence of steps, sequence of activities. They're going to need more visual support. We need to provide information in different ways. So we noticed that she had a within task schedule for Circle, and she was actually directly referencing it. She also used a lot of multimodal environmental cues. She would change the music. She would have certain routines that she would do. If everybody's paying attention, put your hand on your head, those types of things. And I see this as being a big strength of hers, and that's why I'm inclined to give her a 2, that I believe she's proficient at it. If we might even consider going up to exemplary, but I'm thinking about, I noticed that she waited until the 3rd step of the activity before she actually moved those items over from to do to finished. And so I might see some room to let's use it a little bit more methodically. That would be exemplary. Having said that, proficiency rocks. So she's using that really beautifully. So let's go on to number 2, which would show that have supports been embedded to foster the ability to stay actively engaged and persist in daily activities. What does that mean? Is she really getting the emotional hook in all of her students really consistently? Let's look. Is she planning and implementing supports to foster independent use of self-regulatory strategies to foster active engagement and prevent escalation? Is there an emotion keyring present to help students express emotion and request assistance? And so as I was just saying, we were talking about access potentially to an emotion key ring. And so I've kind of pulled one out for you to see exactly what that might be. And using this type of a visual support might be an example of a consistent plan for what if I'm looking at a group of 9 students, one of them is just not feeling that great. That little girl, for example, looked like she was feeling kind of sad. And as a teacher, I often recommend go ahead and wear something like this so that you can pull it out at that particular moment and say, are you sad? And if she's at the emerging language stage, she might be able to say, I am sad. And then on the back side of it, we'd be thinking about offering her some choices of what she could do with that sadness. And you remember, as I can bring her image back up on the screen right here, as you can see here, that if we showed her the sad picture and then on the back side there was a choice of, I just need a little space, I need some time, that might be a nice thing to encourage. And again, as a teacher, it's hard to model that and facilitate that when you're at the front of the group, but if you have a visual support to quickly show to a student, is this how you're feeling? Do you need something here? That would be a real example of using proficient instructional strategy for social emotional engagement. And so let's go back now and think about the score here. Is there an opportunity for growth? And that's what this is all about. It's about professional development and learning. And so we go back over here and say, well, she really does plan so nicely to help students sustain engagement. She's got movement, she's got visuals, she's got lots of great things. I see that as an opportunity, though, for increasing more proficiency here. Infusing choices of strategies, but increasing and decreasing demands, especially with the students that she's seeing kind of fluctuating on their engagement level. So I'm inclined to give that score a 1. And that's more of an emerging. She's inconsistently planning for supports for fostering engagement and so forth, so that we're not quite there proactively with that particular student. But then we go right down to number 3. Have individual interests been considered to stimulate interest and motivation for engagement and learning? Is she really consistently putting into place tasks that have purposeful application, engaging social interaction, real-life meaningful materials, and so forth? This is, again, what I consider to be a proficient area for her. So she's got a great activity, and she's got really nice visual structure that's letting students know where am I supposed to be and what am I going to do next. And an opportunity to go from a 1 to a 2 and emerging to proficient would be, let's start planning for what to do when we see children kind of going up and down that engagement level. The emotion keyring might be a tool that would be really helpful for that. Okay, so now let's look and see what that looks like on the actual score form. And so what we've been talking about is how strong the instructional fidelity is around fostering engagement, that specific piece of the instructional fidelity rubric. And for A number 1, which is have supports been embedded to predict a sequence of activities and steps within the activity, we see we gave her the score of a 2. We would actually put the date of that rating down, whether we did it in the fall, and that would be our original date. That would be great. We also moved on to number 2 to talk about how she's supporting a child's ability to stay actively engaged and persist in daily activities. We discussed the score of a 1, which would be like an emerging ability. She's so close to proficiency. We brainstorm and coach. We're going to come up with some ideas like the emotion keyring. We're going to get that up to a 2 again. Finally, at number 3, have individual interests been considered to stimulate proactively? She's using lots of movement, hands-on, movement-based stimulation, so forth, and we're going to give that a 2. So that just kind of shows you overall how we go about putting the numbers in. And as you're seeing here, this is only 3 of the 9 items that we end up scoring with the instructional fidelity rubric. We would average those out to show whether or not the teacher is implementing somewhere between a 1 and a 2 is what we're really targeting, between emerging and proficiency. If we see teachers all the way down with 2s, that's a teacher that's really sustaining SEEKS practice. We're pretty impressed. You may have been curious as to why we're not being so liberal with the 3s, which is the exemplary ratings. We can look and kind of analyze that individually. There are moments when you just see a teacher so diligently doing this from one transition to the next in one activity that a 3 is just absolutely there. It's wonderful to see a 3s. I'm very conservative with giving those out. We want to see that growth opportunity for every teacher, if we will. And those are there just as a kind of aspire toward those. So what does this look like when we're reporting it at the end of the year? So now that we've kind of done all of this to a certain extent, we've done the social engagement ladders, we've done the instructional fidelity rubrics, let's look at the data sources and a sample end of the year report. When you see this, it all comes together. It makes sense a little bit more. Why did we invest all this time in doing this? How is this really helping us? We looked at both instructional fidelity and the social engagement ladder. So when we look at the instructional fidelity rubric, we will have filled out the entire column of rows, and we've got our rating key right here. We have found that when we've analyzed the number of school districts that we have, that having an average score that's equal to or greater than 1.4 down this list shows that you've got 3 or 4 2s and 3 or 4 1s. That means that you're somewhere between emerging and proficient, and you're implementing all of these things fairly nicely in your classroom. You're going to see some fabulous engagement levels in there. That's what we're looking for here. So that's our overall target, is to get like a 1.4 or above in the performance levels. So let's look at an individual school that was part of our project. And as you look here, you're going to see the absent, emerging, proficient, exemplary. Here are the 3 domains of fostering engagement, getting that emotional hook, presenting information in multiple ways, and fostering expression in multiple ways. The fall is represented with the blue color, and the red is the spring. And this line across the middle was where we hoped the teachers would go in terms of their overall performance measurement. As teachers go into years 2 and years 3, we want them to maintain that level of instructional fidelity. And what you'll notice here is this particular group of teachers at this elementary school started out at an average score of about a 1.3, in terms of their overall instructional fidelity, in terms of fostering engagement, a little bit higher for presenting information in multiple ways, meaning they had lots of visuals in their classroom, and then about a 1.3 again for fostering expression. As the coaching and mentorship proceeded across the year, you saw nice growth in that teacher's ability to, or the group of teachers that were represented here, ability to present information in multiple ways. And we consider that to be awesome, because that whole group of teacher getting an average score over a 2 of proficiency is beautiful. Deep understanding is happening here because students are being given information not just verbally, but visually and through role play and hands-on and movement-based activities. This school, this is a second elementary school, just for comparison purposes, actually saw their greatest growth in getting the emotional hook in the lessons that they brought to the students. Lots of growth in that, going from emerging to proficient in that area. Each kind of group of teachers tend to kind of go in different directions a little bit with the initial coaching, and that one really got the emotional hook. We have a third elementary school, and those you see here started out at the emerging level and moved right past the performance measures into a classroom that was really fostering expression really nicely. So they're getting kids to show what they know a lot, And we put Welcome to the Jungle. That was a third elementary school that came into a district that was new to the district, and we were very impressed by that growth curve in this area. And my point by that is those must be really noisy classrooms, and I mean that with the best compliment, because children who are communicating a lot are children who are learning, and so that's really exciting to see that. So we take that data and we say, what did it produce for us? Because looking at instructional fidelity doesn't really show you anything. You have to know, did the students improve in their overall engagement levels as noted on the engagement ladder? And so we're looking for a performance measure that's somewhere between a 2 and a 3. 2.4 represents a really nice engagement level between being partially and mostly engaged. So let's look at an example in those 3 schools. Going from a no focus group, an emerging fleeting partial engagement, mostly engaged, to fully engaged. And you'll see our performance measure was right around that area here. This group of students in that first elementary school went from a mean engagement level about the partial engaged level. What did that mean? They were pretty well behaved kids at the beginning, but by the end of this spring, they were mostly engaged. They were initiating, they were independent, and they're emotionally invested in what they're doing. That's a right on right there. Second elementary school was getting really good at presenting information in multiple ways, and that resulted in a big jump up to mostly engaged group of students as well. And finally, our third and newest elementary school into that project went from being actually a higher level of mean engagement level at baseline, but to a mostly engaged level by the spring, which is really nice. We have seen significant data producing results in children who are becoming more and more actively engaged in the classroom. Probably the best way to end today's video module, and thank you for your active engagement during this time, is to give you more of an informal measure of success of our teams. Both Cobb County Schools and Atlanta Public Schools have been involved in the State Personnel Development Grant Project for SEEKs for the last couple of years. And a more informal measure of their success would be to see how they react after their web coaching sessions. They have really developed relationships with one another, and when each of them observe each other's videos, there often is these emotional bursts of excitement when you see a group of students move from emerging fleeting to partially engaged to mostly engaged. The teachers are mostly engaged as well, if not fully engaged, I'd have to say. So stay tuned. We will be following up in our next video modules with how do we go about that teacher-to-teacher mentorship. How do you go through the procedures of mentoring one another so that you can feel appreciated for what you're already doing in your classrooms to foster student engagement, but also get excited about opportunities where we can rise student engagement level by changing up the instructional strategies to be more developmentally sensible for our students. Thank you so much.